All right, so stay right there. Okay, and take a few steps forward. Right there, perfect. And a few steps forward. Great. And a couple more steps forward. So if you look at these images, what's actually happening throughout is the flash is trying to guess what the correct output and the correct exposure should be. So it goes ahead, it sends out that pre-flash, it reads, it estimates an exposure off that subject, and then the flash fires to give you the correct flash output. Okay, so if you look, if I flip through these images, the exposure on the subject is about the same whether she's 20 feet away, 15 feet away, 10 feet away, or just a couple feet away from me. That's not what happens with manual. In manual, whatever you set, the power output of that flash will stay the same. So I'm going to switch over to manual. All right? So I'm going to switch my settings here to manual flash. Okay. And I'm going to set my power to 1/8 power. Okay, I'm just picking that arbitrarily. So it's going to be a constant output no matter what. So let me take a quick picture of her here. All right. And now, can you walk back to that pole again? All right, and right there. Walk towards me. Take a couple steps. Perfect. And a couple more steps. Great. And one more time. So what you're going to see is that the exposure on the subject drastically changes depending on her distance from the camera. And in fact, it's actually the distance from the flash. Because here's why. When you've set your exposure for your flash on manual, it's putting out one amount of light. It's not talking to the camera, it's not talking to the flash, it's just putting out one amount of light. So what that means is the inverse square law is going to play a really big effect on the appearance of your photograph, because when she's far away, the light is going to appear much, much dimmer. As she gets closer, it's going to appear brighter and brighter as she gets closer to that light source. All right, so that was just kind of showing you in action, just so you could see really what's happening. And I'm always considering that. I know if I'm shooting in manual and there's any movement, I'm going to have to make a change. So I'm going to kind of power through now. I'm just going to talk about a couple other points on the whole exposure differences, but then we're going to jump into high-speed sync. So let me just mention something. We talked about that. Aperture priority versus manual. All right, so you're shooting with your speed light, and you've got aperture priority, or sorry, you've got TTL or manual are your two options for setting your speed light. But that's independent and not necessarily related to how your camera is metering. Your camera's settings could be aperture priority or manual. So it is conceivable, it is actually possible for you to be in an event where you're shooting aperture priority and TTL. Like you could do that where you set the exposure compensation. If the light's too dark in the room, use aperture priority to brighten it up. And if the speed light is too bright, you'd flash compensation to darken it down. You could do that. But two notes. If you're a Nikon, you can't. Because in aperture priority with a Nikon, when you adjust your exposure compensation, it affects flash output as well, if you're shooting in TTL. So just know that. I wanted to make that note in case you thought you could do that. It won't. If you're messing around with exposure compensation, it also affects your flash, but that's Nikon only. Canon, it will work. So hopefully that helps out a couple people who might run into a problem. What it comes down to is you can shoot all these different combinations. You could shoot aperture priority and TTL if you're a Canon. You have less control because you're leaving your exposure up to the camera a bit, and you are leaving your flash exposure up to the flash and camera as well. You could shoot your camera on manual and flash TTL. You could, I mean, there's other combinations as well, but the most control is manual and manual. It just takes more time. So it depends on what is best for the type of work that you do. All right, so let's talk about high-speed sync. High-speed sync. We already talked about yesterday what sync speed is. And so I had a little illustration, and sync speed is the highest or the fastest shutter speed that your camera can have and still work with a flash. So most of our cameras is like 1/200th of a second, 1/250th, and the reason is that you'll actually have the flash fire and catch one of the shutters, and I have an animation. High-speed sync lets you go faster than that. High-speed sync allows you to exceed your camera's sync speed, which is written in the manual. In fact, you can go to a couple thousandths of a second and not have a problem. And this is extremely, extremely useful. For example, if you want to be able to shoot at really wide apertures, but when you shoot at really wide apertures, it brings up all the ambient light with it. So when you can use really fast shutter speeds darken down the ambient. So it allows you to shoot wide with your flash and not have an overpowering amount of ambient. So we're going to see how that comes into play. And this was my illustration of how shutter speed works. So the first shutter, or sync speed, the first shutter goes up when they're totally open, a flash fires, and the second shutter comes up. And when you have a problem is when it's too fast. There's actually never a time where both shutters or both curtains are open. So what happens in this example is it's still moving and your flash fires, this is your sync speed, and you're going to get that bar. Okay, high-speed sync, however, what it does is the flash is set to fire many, 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 many times. So the entire time that curtain is moving, you're getting lots of little pulses of light that make sure that you cover your entire frame with light without clipping. So here's what it looks like. In a fast exposure, the whole time it's flashing in order to illuminate the whole image. It's flashing with those moving shutters. So here's another one a little bit slower. So now your entire image will be exposed without having to worry about catching your shutter. Okay, so things are not always as easy as they seem. I will tell you that you do have some downsides to high-speed sync. Because you have the flash firing so quickly, it cannot give you full output. The flash gets significantly weaker. So then you often need to move your light closer or put together multiple flashes in order to get the same amount of actual output from the original, what the original exposure was, the original flash. So I'm going to walk you through what this looks like. Okay. So for high-speed sync, I've got an image here. I'm under my sync speed, 1/125th of a second, 5.6, ISO 100. My flash is at full power. But I don't want to shoot at 5.6. I want to shoot at 2.8. So I open up, right? So we went from 5.6 to 2.8. And this is what I'm thinking in my head. Okay, I'm opening up. Well, unfortunately, now the image goes overexposed. So I know that I need to have a faster shutter speed to darken down the ambient. So when I go to 200, I mean, it helped, but it's not good. Like it's still overexposed. I helped a little bit. So what I really want to be able to do is I really want to be able to go over that sync speed. If I go to 500th of a second, it's going to darken down the ambient. Let me just go back. So what it does is it darkens down the ambient. Okay, I ran into a problem though. Because I now switched over into high-speed sync, doesn't it look like there's no flash? Because all those little pulses don't have enough power. So it's not showing up. So now I have to start doing that little juggle. So what do I have available to me to make my flash appear brighter? I could turn the power up all the way. It's already turned up. When you're using high-speed sync, you should be shooting at full power because it's going to decrease the power anyway. All right, so I already have it at full power. I could bring my light closer, but unfortunately, it'll be in my frame, so I don't actually have that option this time. Okay, so my lens, maybe it doesn't go open any wider than 2.8. So really the only thing that I can do is increase my ISO. So I'm going to make my entire image more sensitive to light, which means the light on her face will look brighter, but then light in the background also looks brighter. But I'm already in high-speed sync, so I don't care about shutter speed anymore. I can close down to compensate. So if you watch, went to ISO 500, the light on her face got brighter, but so did the background. No problem, I go to 1/2000th of a second. And this image was not exactly out of camera. I gave it more of a black point, but the rest of it was the same because I was including